And we're live.
Okay.
Hello. So
Hello.
welcome. And joining me today is Philip Goff. So Philip, for those who don't know you, can you say something about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I've been teaching philosophy at Central European University in Budapest for the last 4 years. And I'm just about in a week to start doing the same thing at the University of Durham.
Oh.
So I'm in the throes of moving, which is a bloody nightmare at the moment. But yeah, so I guess in philosophy, my main interest is consciousness. Trying to fit consciousness into our general theory of reality. So I guess my starting point is that we know that consciousness is real. Nothing is more evident than the reality of our feelings and experiences. So it has to fit in somehow, but it's notoriously difficult to find a place for consciousness in our theory of the world. And the two standard views on this, materialism on the one hand and dualism on the other, I find both quite implausible. And instead, I defend the view that's become known as Russellian monism, which seems to me the perfect middle way between these two extremes. I think it has all the benefits of materialism on the one hand and dualism on the other without any of the problems. So it's the perfect view. So I published a book last year, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. The half of that is attacking materialism or physicalism, and then half of it is exploring and defending Russellian monism and trying to bring together a lot of the new literature on that. And then since then, I've been trying to do a lot of stuff aimed at a general audience, a lot of articles aimed at a general audience. And I'm currently working on a book aimed at a general audience, which is currently called Galileo's Error, a manifesto for a new science of consciousness. And that should be coming out in August 2019.
Ah, excellent. Cool. Poor Galileo.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I want to ask you about a lot of that stuff, but I want to start. I think it's interesting to start with in an area that we agree, that we fundamentally agree. Although I think we diverge pretty quickly, but even so, not maybe as much as you might expect. But anyway, to start with the point of agreement, the fundamental reality of consciousness.
Did I tweet the link before we get?
Oh yeah, go ahead and tweet it. Yeah, it's there. I even added you in the, if I did it right, if you're at Philip_Goff, you should get a notification.
I can't see that actually. It's not in my notifications.
Oh, really? Uh-oh, did I misspell your name? No.
I've just got, we will share the link before going live.
Okay, well, let me just respond to that then. And try to show where that is. Okay. Well, I see it on mine. Yeah, that's interesting that you don't see it. Okay, so philosopher stymied by.
I could just go to you, couldn't I? I could just go to your.
Yeah.
I think it's Philip with one L. That's the.
Oh, is that the problem?
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, I suck. I can never tell how many L's there are or P's, to be honest.
Okay, that's fine.
I got you now.
Okay, so that's retweeted.
Okay, and I'll fix that misspelling of your name. Yeah, now I'm noticing there are too many L's. Okay, I suck.
We can.
Well, I'm prepared to be wrong all day today, so this is the first instance of that, I suppose. My apologies. So I wanted to get back to sort of talking about a place where we fundamentally agree, which is the reality of consciousness. So,
right.
My own history, in case anyone cares, is I started out when coming to this as kind of a dualist, a substance dualist, actually. Because of considerations about consciousness and the Cartesian kinds of arguments having to do with conceivability of mind without body. And I gradually came to reject that, although not 100%, but because my credence in it was gradually lowered because of, causal considerations, which I think is pretty standard dichotomy between those, the standard dichotomy between dualism and materialism. On the one hand, there's the people who take consciousness very seriously. And on the other hand, there's people who think, well, it's got to be fitting into the causal structure of the world somehow because it does something. So I kind of became more in that camp. And I don't want to defend physicalism in the sense that I want to claim that it's true. Rather, what I want to argue is that we don't have any good reason to think it isn't true. So that's a slightly lower claim than trying to say, well, we know physicalism is true and that all the other views are wrong. But anyway, so where we fundamentally agree is this diehard commitment to the realism of consciousness.
Great.
Yeah. And so, and that seems to me to be an area where, like, for instance, illusionism and these other kinds of views, they give up the game right off the bat by saying, oh, look, we're not talking about the same sort of thing that you guys are talking about, like me and you, for instance. They're not talking about consciousness as given to us in our experience, but something else. And that sounds like they're changing the topic or redefining the terms of the battle. So so that I want to be very clear that I think that there's just not really good reason for denying consciousness. So I wonder if you could tell us what your reasons for commitment to the reality of consciousness. Is it just introspection or is it something more?
Yeah, it's good. Well, just on illusionism, I mean, I completely agree with everything you just said, but I'm probably more open to illusionism than many of my anti-physicalist colleagues, in the sense of taking it seriously and not thinking it's just obviously incoherent. So illusionism being is roughly the view that consciousness doesn't exist, that the brain creates an illusion that it exists when it doesn't really. Keith Frankish, for example, defends this view. Daniel Dennett seems to at times. But so a lot of people, a very common reaction to it is for people to just say, well, this can't be true because, who is subject to the illusion? You need consciousness to have an illusion in the first place. So it's just straightforwardly contradictory. Galen Strawson says this, for example. But I think that depends. And I wrote this there was a special issue of Journal of Consciousness Studies on Keith Frankish's illusionism, and I had a paper. It depends what you think about thought or mental representation. I guess still the dominant view in analytic philosophy is that thought and mental representation, or at least thought, are distinct from consciousness. You can see that the dominant theories of consciousness in the 20th century, like by Fodor or Davidson, didn't mention consciousness at all. So if we can make sense of mental representation or thought independently of consciousness, then it seems to me illusionism is perfectly coherent, because you can say, or it's not obviously incoherent, you can say, we think there's consciousness, but there isn't. And that makes sense if thought is independent. I mean, as it happens, I am one of the growing minority who thinks thought and mental representation is a kind of consciousness. So I do think ultimately that it's incoherent, but that's a contentious view. But so I'm kind of open to take it seriously. And David Sharma's got a very interesting new paper on this stuff, taking illusionism seriously, and we had an interesting conference on it. But in terms of coming back to your question, well, it's just a question of starting points, really. I mean, a lot of analytic philosophers think, our only source of data about reality is empirical in the sense of third-person observation and experiments. And everything else has to be justified in terms of that, or accounted for in terms of that. But I mean, we all know that even that data is not certain. There's all sorts of skeptical arguments, and there seems to me, it's not obvious that that's the only starting point for knowledge. And it seems to me the evident reality of, I think Descartes got one thing completely right, the evident reality of my own feeling. To take an obvious example, I'm in pain, and I attend to my pain, and I think I'm feeling like this. It seems to me that is known with a greater certainty that I really am feeling like this than anything else. So that seems to me much more evident than that there's a table in front of me. It seems to be more evident. So I wouldn't say 100% certainty about any of this, but I think Descartes was right that the mind is better known than the body. The reality of conscious experience is more evident than the reality of the external world. So why would I start with the external world? And so in a way, at least they should be on a par. The third person observation experiments on the one hand, in a way I do want to take them on a par. How do we do metaphysics? Sorry, I'm jumping from one thing. How do we find out the nature of reality? A lot of analytic philosophers think, well, just take third-person observation experiments. What I want to do is take third-person observation experiments, absolutely crucial, to respect what the empirical data is telling us. But there's another source of data, the evident reality of consciousness. And I see the project of metaphysics is trying to find, the simplest, most parsimonious theory that it accommodates both. So even if you had a theory, people talk about the grand unified theory that physics is hoping. If you had a theory that accounted for all the data of third-person observation experiments, that still wouldn't be enough, because there's another piece of data we need accommodating, the evident reality of consciousness. So they both seem to me at least on a par, and so we need to accommodate both. Until we get overwhelming reason to think consciousness is an illusion, but I don't buy any of the arguments. Yeah, so I guess that's my starting point. I talk about this actually. I think the chapter in my book I'm most interested in, I like best, is the final chapter. I talk about sort of methodology and talk about this kind of thing, and how the datum of consciousness is hugely neglected in metaphysics more generally. People just how do we do metaphysics? It seems to be we've got this thing we know exists, and I would argue that we sort of know its nature. So using that as a source of data in metaphysics more generally, but yeah, that's my starting point. We've got two sources of data. We need to put them together.
Right, and I can agree with that. I guess my question would be what it means to accommodate the data. So of course, I want a theory of consciousness that accommodates first-person data. The question I guess I would ask is, in order for that to be successful, is it beholden to our common sense kind of apprehension of consciousness, or so there's going to have to be some level of revision at some point, it seems to me, no matter which way you go. And that opens the door to at least some kind of weak version of illusionism, not the strong version, which says that consciousness doesn't exist in the sense that we think that it does, but the weaker version, which I think Chalmers actually distinguishes in his kind of new paper, The Meta Problem, where he talks about, look, there's got to be some elements which we attribute to our conscious experience, which might fall away in a final theory of it. And so in that sense, we're all, every theory is committed to some version of illusionism, because there's no way to accommodate it just as, I think, for instance, even Russellian monism is going to end up saying something like this with respect to, well, it depends on the version. I know we'll get to this later, but with respect to whether or not the microparticles and their elementary forms of consciousness or whatever, those things aren't available to us in introspection. So there's got some sense of illusion there, possibly. Are you open to that, or would you resist even that kind of weak?
Yeah, it's a really good question. How exactly characterize the datum? And I would do it like this. I would say, I'm very much open that I don't think we're infallible about all aspects of consciousness, and we make mistakes, and especially when we start theorizing. It might be a bit like, was it Augustine said about time?
Yeah.
We know what it
is until we think about it or theorize about it.
I think consciousness would be like that. I think we sort of, even when we do get it right pre-theoretically, then we start thinking. So what the datum is, I would say, think about what philosophers tend to call phenomenal concepts. I prefer to call them experiential concepts, maybe a bit more of a sort of accessible term. People always think it means phenomenal, like extraordinary. When you talk to non-philosophers, they, phenomenal concept. Anyway, so these are the kind of concepts you form when you attend to your experience and you just think about it in terms of what it's like or how it feels. I'm in pain. I just attend to my pain and I form this concept, feeling like this. Not even those words, just you form a concept that's wholly based on attending to the state. I would say consciousness realism is the view that those concepts are satisfied, that they genuinely mirror reality. So that's what I take to be the datum, not any. So I wouldn't want to revise, or I'd want overwhelming reason to revise them. So maybe we're making all sorts of mistakes, and you know, but that's the bedrock for me, that those experiential or phenomenal concepts are, you know, satisfied, spot on.
Well, what's the spot on part? What does that add to it?
Well, just like, you know, a concept is satisfied when it mirrors reality, or it correctly represents reality. Like the classical concept of God as an all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good being, that's satisfied when there really is an all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good being. And or, you know, so contrast with our concept of time, you know, or free will. You know, I think maybe we have a pre-theoretical concept of free will or time, and maybe that can be revised a bit. So it's, you know, the original notion of maybe the original notion of free will, you know, is sort of libertarian, that there's no how do we define it? No causes of your decision, no prior cause of your decision. But we can sort of move it on to, you know, a little bit of more of a compatibilist, or maybe our notion of time can change. But so we have the idea that there's the concept, the idea, and whether it genuinely corresponds to reality. Whereas, I mean, that's not necessarily my view on free will. I'm just saying that's a kind of plausible view. Whereas in consciousness, I think these set of concepts that we know accurately represent, and then it's a difficult philosophical question. Well, what do they represent? What do they tell us? And we can argue about that, and we can get it wrong. But the starting point would be those concepts do get it right. Yeah.
So in this, I mean, I just kind of want to explore this a little bit more. But so suppose that I'm in pain, and I form the phenomenal concept of that this pain sucks or whatever. It's ouchy. And then in order to be a conscious realist, in your sense, you're saying that there must be at least one occasion where that gets it right about what it's like to be me. Is that the claim?
Yeah, maybe put it a little bit more precisely, because there are all sorts of rough and ready phenomenal or experiential concepts. Like, you know, we just say, oh, the pain I had yesterday, or pain is a kind of very generic, vague concept. And maybe if you're thinking this pain sucks, that's a kind of very generic. But what I'm talking about, I guess, to put the point more precisely, is what Chalmers calls direct phenomenal concepts. So they're the subclass, maybe they're kind of paradigm, where you just, you don't kind of bring any templates, and you just attend to the experience, and you think that. So I'm talking about those kind of concepts. Those kind of concepts, I'd say, yeah, when you form those kind of concepts, you get it right. Yeah.
Get it right with respect to what it's like for you. I'm trying to figure out what the getting it right part is, because those kinds of concepts, as far as I understand it, somehow it's supposed to be that the experience itself is the target. I mean, it constitutes part of the thought. That's what the directness is. Is that what you're also saying, or is this something different than the Chalmers way of putting it?
That sounds a plausible a view. I tend to agree with what you went on to give a kind of theoretical characterization. But what we're just talking about now is something, a kind of starting point for theory. And it's just that those concepts get it right. And what, you know, those concepts, as you say, they characterize the state in terms of what it's like. So when I let's maybe think of the thought rather than, so I think the thought, it's like this to be me. And, you know, I'm attending to my pain. It's like this to be me. I say, that thought is true, and I know that thought is true. You know, it is like this to be me, and or you know, there is something that it's like to be me. You know, well, that's an interesting question actually, whether that fits in. I'm not sure. Take that back. But anyway, in the specific case, you know, it's like this to be me, and it really is like this to be me. Yeah.
Okay. So and this is what you call in the book the consciousness constraint. That's what we're talking about here. That this is a constraint on theorizing. So I wonder. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I want to ask, but I wonder how you might respond to a kind of, I guess, Wittgensteinian inspired arguments against private languages and that sort of thing. So some people, and I'm not one of them necessarily, but I wonder what you might say. So some people might say, look, when we talk to each other, and I say I'm in pain and I have a throbbing headache, and you say, oh man, that's terrible. I know what that's like. we have to be able to communicate. We are talking about the same thing, right? My pain, in a sense. And these kind of direct concepts that we're talking about seem essentially private. Like they're only concepts that I can have. But in order for us to be talking about the same thing, it seems like you have to have the same concept as I. So some people would take this as an argument that these kinds of things have to be public language concepts. In order for us to be talking about the same thing at all, there has to be some common concept between us. And so I just wonder what your response to that kind of, that's supposed to present a kind of foothold for skepticism about the starting point. It's not one I'm especially sympathetic to, but I do think it's serious. So I wonder what you think.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I thought about this a lot when I debated. I had a department at CEU in Budapest who's very good Wittgensteinian, Hanok Benyami, and there's an audio recording of that on my website somewhere. But I can't remember what I think now.
Well, I'll link to the audio and then maybe you'll remember.
I mean, I guess I sort of think, I think that David Papineau's got a very good article which I kind of broadly agree with. I think that we are hardwired to sort of assume we're both talking about the same thing when we, or hardwired just to assume someone's in pain when they exhibit various behavior. And I don't see why that couldn't get. So the Wittgensteinian argument is supposed to show that it's supposed to show that they're incommunicable, but also on the basis that they're just empty and the view's incoherent. And I've always done the main move, question begging. What does Wittgenstein say? Something like, what's the key line? I know I'm right or something, and so which means that there is no right. And I sort of think, no, that's just question begging. Anyway, but I don't see why the communicability problem can't be just answered by just, that we're just hardwired to make certain phenomenal attributions when we see certain behavior, and to assume, and then when society gets going, we assume that we both, what it's like for me to see tomatoes is the same as what it's like for everyone else to see tomatoes, and we just make these assumptions and we get on with it. And just to press this a bit further, I think the kind of crux of the argument here is whether or not we have the same concept. So you're comfortable denying that. Like when you say you're in pain, when I say I'm in pain, and you say, wow, you really are in pain, you're employing a different concept than I am, because you're employing a concept that's based on my behavior and making assumptions related to your personal concept about it's like this to be in pain or something like that. But so we're strictly speaking talking past each other if we're not employing the same concept. Isn't that right? I don't want to say that. So what's gone wrong? I mean, as I say, we're going to distinguish experiential concepts in general from these paradigmatic, direct experiential concepts where you just attend to your own pain and things. But they're just, one kind. We can, I can think of pain in all sorts of ways. I can think of pain experientially when I'm not feeling it. And I think what I do, I see you exhibiting behavior and I think you're in pain, and I employ an experiential concept when I do that. And it's a difficult philosophical question. How do I know you really are? Given that I know about pain from my own case, how do I know you really are in pain? How do I know what it's like for you to see colors is the same? This is an interesting skeptical difficulties arise here, but there are skeptical difficulties all over the place. How do we know there's an external world? So I assume it's, rationally legitimate to assume other people have minds and that these assumptions are somehow rational.
Yeah, but that's not the real worry that I'm trying to get at. I agree with all the things you just said, but doesn't it seem, so suppose I say I'm in pain and I am on the basis of my utterance, that the justification of that utterance is a direct phenomenal concept. And then you say, no, you're not, because I'm not limping or howling and I don't seem distracted and I can do math and all those sorts of things, as easy as I normally could anyway. So it seem like you should be contradicting me, but you're not contradicting me, because we've said different things. I've expressed the direct, I'm expressing a thought that has as a part of its concept a direct phenomenal concept, and you're using a different concept, a public language concept of pain. So it just seems like a kind of common sense datum should be that we're disagreeing when I say I'm in pain on this basis and you say, no, you're not. And it doesn't seem like this kind of starting point gets that right. You're not really disagreeing with me, in other words.
Well, I don't think when I ascribe pain to you, it is a behavioral concept. I don't think
well, public language concept. I mean, one that's ordinary third person and not.
I think it's an experiential concept. I think we both employ an experiential concept. And the question is, how do experiential concepts get into public language? And the thought would be that, well, we just partly hardwired, partly socialized to take certain forms of behavior as evidence for someone having certain experiences. But that doesn't mean it's a behavioral concept or so I would say it's an experiential concept. And there's a bit of trickiness here, and it's partly an empirical question. How do these experiential concepts enter into public language? And clearly the direct ones can't, but the more general ones. Or can the direct? Or at least the other ones can. And it's something to do with just, these hardwired or socialized assumptions we make about taking certain forms of behavior as evidence for having certain experiences.
Okay, so I'm still not quite getting the sense in which we're disagreeing.
Because we're both employing the same concept. It's an experiential concept.
But mine's direct and yours is not, so it's not the same concept?
When you're employing a direct concept.
I mean, I thought that was the move you were making earlier, was that on the one hand, there's two different concepts. One's an experiential one, which somehow involves you thinking about the thing when you're not having it. The other one's direct, when you kind of just take it up and say, this is my pain experience. This is the painfulness of it or something.
Well, but they're not sort of two different, I mean, they're different classes of the same concepts. So they're, it's just, I mean, the direct ones are the kind of paradigmatic, and there's a relationship. So, we have these paradigmatic forms, and then on the basis of that, we form a so I have, I'm feeling pain and I attend to my specific pain, but then we form, more general concepts of the general concept of pain. And you make me think, actually. I suppose maybe there are some details I need to sort of think about. But I mean, I suppose when you ascribe pain to yourself, maybe you're employing the direct one, but you're also generally employing a general notion of pain, which is very intimately related to the direct one. And that's the one that enters into public language. Do I want to say that? I'll have to think about that, whether the direct ones are in public language. I mean, certainly I can, I'm not sure. Maybe
okay.
So there are tricky issues here, I suppose. I'm not impressed there's any kind of insuperable difficulties or reasons to think that the concepts are not coherent, but no.
Okay, and so can I go ahead then and segue to why? So if we both want to admit that that this is a good starting point, which I agree that we need the two sources of data. On the one hand, the datum that consciousness is real. I don't think we always get it right, but I do think that it's. I mean, once when I was an undergraduate, just as an anecdote, in my Descartes class, the professor assigned us a homework assignment, said, can you think of anything Descartes didn't doubt? And I was, he didn't doubt that he had conscious experience. I just reading Dennett. Dennett seemed very much to doubt that. So I was like, okay, there's something that he did. I mean, he didn't go as far as some of these contemporary people who want to claim that we're just totally wrong about the nature of conscious experience. So I think that the starting point for us has to be, well, there's third person data and there's first person data. And we don't want to neglect either one of them. So I think that's good. And we both agree on that. But then the question is, well, why? So my view is that that's not incompatible with a very austere form of physicalism. Your view is that it is. So we start from the same place, end up on other sides of the fence. So I just wonder, what is it about admitting that the reality of consciousness is non-negotiable has this kind of problem?
Good, excellent. Okay, so, well, it's a huge, complicated debate, I'm sure. But I guess my starting point, and what I'm trying to express in a lot of the the popular level, or I don't mean to demean it by saying popular level, it's also sort of interdisciplinary, isn't it? And popular level discussions, I mean, so I think actually, David Chalmers was hugely influential in the 1990s, if I can just digress slightly, with this, getting people to take seriously the problem of consciousness and confront that head on. And people do now take it seriously, but a very common reaction is to say, okay, there's a problem, but we just need to do more neuroscience. And it'll start, if you look to the great success of physical science in explaining more and more of our universe, that ought to give us confidence that we just keep doing neuroscience. So, what I want to kind of get more into the public and interdisciplinary mind is the sort of, the philosophical reasons why physical science might not be up to this task, which was, there in Chalmers in the conscious mind, but, it's a pretty hard book, The Conscious Mind, in a way. It's accessible for an academic philosophy book, but so I think it was more just the sort of the hard problem that was the thing that broke into consciousness. So the way I put it, without trying to get it, so when people try to get into the arguments, they get quickly very complicated. And the way I try to put it, just the popular level starting point, is that consciousness is an essentially qualitative phenomenon, just in the sense that it involves qualities. It's like the redness of a red experience, the sweet taste of honey, the smell of coffee, whereas physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary. And I just think you can't capture those kind of qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science. So this is, and this, the nice historical point, hence the name for my new book. Galileo, from the very start, appreciated this, right? He only intended physical science to be a partial description of reality, right? He hoped it could cope with the mathematical features, but he never dreamt that you could capture in that kind of quantitative language the qualities of conscious experience, right? So, he set things off by narrowing the scope of inquiry of physical science, and that went really well, right? And but in my view, the reason it's gone so well is because Galileo narrowed the scope of inquiry. So when people say, "Oh, look, the success of physical science has gone so well, it's one day going to explain consciousness," my response is, no, it's gone so well because it wasn't designed to deal with consciousness. And if Galileo were to time travel to the present day and hear about this hard problem of explaining consciousness in physical science terms, he'd say, yeah, of course there is. Consciousness involves qualities, and physical science is designed to deal with quantities. So I still think we're going through a period of history where we're so blown away by the success of physical science that we think, oh no, God, this really works. Like philosophy didn't work for thousands of years, and this works. But I think sooner or later we've got to realize, well, it works because it's aimed at something quite narrow, roughly kind of mathematical models of kind of behavior, at least in the case of physics, slightly more. And there's something else going on here, that the qualitative reality of consciousness, and so sooner or later we've got to sort of try and put the two together. I mean, I think it's not that many people deny the reality of consciousness, but at the same time, I think they don't explicitly take it on as a datum in its own right when they're sort of thinking about their big theory of the world. They think, we just do physics or we just do science. They're not thinking of it as a datum in its own right. So that's the kind of thing I try to. Anyway, that's the starting point.
I like the point about Galileo. I don't know if that's an error. I kind of get where you're coming from there, though, that the error was dismissing consciousness and not having it part of science somehow. So I understand the point. And of course, the assayer, published in 1620 something or another, maybe. And Descartes follows soon afterwards. I don't know exactly when his Discourse on Method was written, but not long after that. And of course, Descartes does the same thing, right? So to focus on the mathematical explanations, and then he just sees no hope of doing anything with respect to consciousness. It is interesting, I think, that some of Descartes' pessimism has been unwarranted. So we'll get back to Galileo in a second, but focusing on Descartes for a second, he famously claimed that no machine could generate natural language in a way that a person would accept, and that we know is demonstrably false, because they're. I mean, the interesting thing about the Turing test that they do nowadays is that not only do some people judge the machines are people, but they judge that the people are machines, which are very interesting. But anyway, so we know that artificial intelligence has at least got to the point where, in limited circumstances, that can generate strings of sentences which seem to be produced by an intelligent being. And Descartes just thought that was flatly not possible. Now, of course, that's, you might say, well, that's because they're not dealing with consciousness in their language production or something. But so I just wonder why we should be so pessimistic. So I understand the point that, yes, they removed the qualities and science clocks on. But that's the way science often proceeds, right? They artificially limit. So, I mean, quantum mechanics, one electron, the equation for one electron moving in a vacuum. Okay, but you limit everything else, and then you work up to that other stuff successively. So why isn't this just the normal way science does? If we don't understand something, we put it to the side, work on things we do understand, but eventually the same methodology would be extended to the things which are sidelined.
Sure. Okay, yeah, I think you put that very well. Yeah, so I think what I just said about Galileo and the history, I don't take that to be an argument that consciousness will never be explained in the terms of physical science. I take it to be rather a response to an argument that it will. So I think a lot of people, I mean, you talk about causal closure, and I think that's motivates philosophers, or that's certainly what philosophers say motivates them. But I think more broadly, and I suspect with philosophers as well, it's this idea, look how well physical science has gone. It's got to explain consciousness. So it's a response to that. I think, well, no, here's a different way of thinking about the history of physical science and that the purpose of physical science and why it's been successful, that doesn't draw that conclusion. So that's what that's doing. But sure, it's not in itself reason to think that we need an argument. So why is it the physical science? So, well, again, it's the point about the different qualities and quantities that it's hard to see how you can capture qualities in a purely quantitative vocabulary. Okay, now you might say, okay, well, we haven't done it yet, but one day we'll do it. And I suppose at that point I would bring in the knowledge argument, I don't think the knowledge argument, you don't really need to get into the far-fetched details of Mary and stuff. You just, here's the essential point. A neuroscientist, a congenitally blind neuroscientist will never know what it's like to see colors through reading neuroscience. And that seems to me an incredibly strong premise. And it's so that.
Can I just ask a quick question about that? Because that's a kind of unusual way of putting the knowledge argument, I think, or at least its essential point. So for someone like me, my view on the knowledge argument is that Mary could make the relevant deductions inside her room as long as she had the relevant concept. So I think it's kind of cheating to say that she needs to be able to know what red is without having the phenomenal concept of red. I mean, no one would do that with the other stuff. So if she didn't know what water was, and never had the concept of water, then of course she couldn't deduce that water was H2O. You need the other concept. So in the case of consciousness, we need the relevant phenomenal concepts to know what we're talking about, how to make the deductions. And that requires that she has seen red, but it still is compatible with the claim that there's these a priori deductions, because acquiring the concept allows her to connect the two, but doesn't play any justificatory role in the deduction that's being made. Right. So it just seems to me kind of unfair to say, well, the blind neuroscientist who has no concept about the phenomenal qualities, that's in the phenomenal sense at least, of course that person couldn't know, because that's just asking them to make to know something that they don't have the concept of. So I just wonder why that's not an overly austere way of thinking about what the knowledge argument is trying to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we'd have to talk about Mariana. You know Mariana, who's Anita Rumlins, who's in in the black and white room. Oh, she gets color chips, right? So she gets the experiences, and so she gets the concept of experiences. But then the thought is she still wouldn't know which of those color chips is the color of the sky or which is the color of tomatoes. But
right.
then,
Well, that I deny that. I don't think there's any way that would be what happened. I mean, there's just an intuition loggerheads maybe, but certainly she'd be able to tell that the red color chip is more like the orange one than it is like the blue one. And then I think the relevant brain states are going to line up in something like that. This is by the work, some of the work that's come out of Adam Poutz's work recently, that there's, you know, the neural responses to these things form a kind of family, or in a way that tracks what the properties are more than the external properties, like the reflectance properties. And so I just think that, yeah, the brain state that is the redness is going to be more similar to the brain state for orangeness than it is the blueness. And that's going to be a kind of bridging thing that's going to allow her to connect. I mean, I just don't see why that wouldn't work in principle.
I mean, I suppose I think, but in a way, why wouldn't the congenitally blind neuroscientist be able to get it? Because, so look, I mean, I think physical science and neuroscience works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, and I could say a little more about what I mean by that. And you know, I suppose if consciousness can be explained in those sort of terms, then it must essentially be a kind of purely quantitative phenomenon. And the neuroscientist has all the blind neuroscientist, congenitally blind neuroscientist, has all the relevant kind of quantitative concepts. So, I mean, what are they lacking? Why can't we give them the that concept in those terms? Or,
well, because they're lacking the direct phenomenal concept, which would be required to know what they're talking about. I think that's where you and I agree that that's the datum, is that to get a full to get the data, you have to have these kinds of concepts. You don't have the data without that. So she's missing the data. And without the data, she can't connect the other data to this data. Actually,
I'm saying more. I'm putting my neck out more than I need to. I mean, yeah, I actually think so. Like, to digress slightly, I'm not going to dodge the point, but I mean, I think so I've been like spending 15% of my time on the sort of popular level debate or interdisciplinary on the academic debate, and I think, you know, there's kind of very different things going on in these debates. So I think, you know, in the popular level debate, there's a sort of general assumption that we need an explanation of consciousness. You know, we need to give an intelligible account of how consciousness comes to be. And there I would sort of press the knowledge argument and so on. A lot of the academic debate is because, so I think still the dominant position, materialist position, the so-called phenomenal concept strategy, proponents of that tend to hold that actually you don't need an explanation of consciousness in a certain sense. All you need are these sort of brute identities. You know, you say conscious states are identical with brain states, and that's the end of it. And it's sort of a philosophical confusion to sort of think we need this explanation of consciousness. So there are these two very different debates. So I guess in the popular debate, I'd kind of push the knowledge argument. But actually, as I say in my book, I was sort of defending. I've sort of realized I don't need to defend that the knowledge. I mean, as I say in my book, I don't think the knowledge argument in itself does demonstrate the falsity of physicalism. What it does demonstrate is that there are concepts these experiential concepts are not physical, functional, quantitative concepts. So it demonstrates a kind of conceptual dualism. Okay, and then we've got a further step. Okay, well, why can't that just be conceptual dualism? So that's the dominant materialist position in academic philosophy. Now, there's a conceptual dualism, these two radically different kinds of concept, you know, experiential concepts and physical, functional concepts, but actually they refer to the same thing. So at the level of reference, brain states, just experiential phenomena, just are physical, functional phenomena or whatever. So I think the knowledge argument proves the conceptual dualism, but then we have to take a further step to prove the metaphysical.
Yeah, but I guess I wasn't trying to invoke the phenomenal concept strategy in that way. Although I'm not, I'm open to it, and the brute identity, of David Papineau and Ned Block. I think that's a respectable way to go, depending on your philosophy of science. A lot of this depends on your background views about philosophy of science. But I'm also open to the other kind of Canberra way of looking at things, where you need these a priori entailments in order to be respectable. And so that's what I was trying to press on, was that it seems to me that there is an a priori entailment in the vicinity, but it requires having the relevant concept. Just like every other a priori entailment requires having the concepts that connect the two. So in this case, it's a phenomenal concept, but I wasn't trying to say we don't need an explanation of consciousness. I actually sort of tend to think maybe we do. I don't know, maybe we don't, but that's a different question. It's just the question of, so if you're a physicalist, why isn't it enough that there's a kind of a priori entailment from the brain stuff to the phenomenology? And if that's what's required, then it seems to me that Mary could have it as long as she had the right concepts. That was kind of the point that I was trying to make.
So I suppose I've been thinking that one is either someone who thinks mental concepts are sort of functional concepts, and there's an a priori entailment, or you have the phenomenal concept strategy where you think, no, mental concepts and experiential concepts are really different to functional concepts, but there's a sort of they co-refer, so there's no a priori entailment.
No, I'm a fan of the middle way.
Yeah, cool. Okay, that's interesting. So you think there are these distinctive kind of experiential concepts, but there could be an a priori entailment. Okay, maybe I need to think more about that. But I suppose I think if you do agree with the phenomenal concept strategy to the extent that you think there are these distinctive kind of introspective concepts, then surely they would be completely isolated from, I mean, if I were just a demonstrative concept, that thing, then it's going to be kind of, not going to have any kind of information in it. It's going to be sort of conceptually isolated from other things going on. So there isn't going to be an a priori entailment.
Well, that's a demonstrative concept. These, I mean, maybe that's your view about what phenomenal concepts are. It certainly doesn't seem to me that that's what they are, because of the reason you're giving. I mean, demonstrative concepts, if they're just demonstratives, they don't tell you what it is you're pointing at. So the phenomenal concepts are more direct than that. Somehow we're, I don't want to use the dreaded A word, but somehow we're acquainted, or somehow it's more than merely pointing at it blindly. So I take that point.
Well, maybe
but you're not. But just to, back up and find the common ground again. I mean, you're not denying, are you, that the entailments in any sense require the relevant concepts? Are you? I mean, to make any to get an a priori entailment between water and H2O, you need both the concept of H2O and the concept of water. I mean, you're not denying that, right?
No, right, good. So you made me realize something that I hadn't appreciated before, that the knowledge argument doesn't entail there's no a priori entailment. I might take this back at a later point. But what I'm thinking now is, but it just entails that there's a a distinctive kind of concept.
Yeah, that's what I take it to show. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So I hadn't really been appreciating that combination of positions. But maybe this is a good moment to introduce this distinction between transparent and opaque concepts. Should I do that? Good. Maybe I can try and respond to your position in those terms, or think about it at least in those terms. Okay, so this is a distinction that's very important in my academic work, this distinction between transparent and opaque concepts. So contrasting it with Chalmers, so Chalmers in his academic work sets things up in terms of what he calls his framework of two-dimensional semantics, and I've actually, disagree a lot with that way. I think that is sort of too contentious in lots of respects. And so, although I'm fully on side with Chalmers in big picture terms, and, he's a really important influence, one part of what I do in my book is I disagree with that whole two-dimensional semantics approach. Anyway, we don't need to go there. But so my framework has the benefit of being much simpler as well, but I think it's also better. But anyway, transparent concepts are defined as concepts that reveal the essence of their reference. So an example might be concept of a triangle. You know, if you've got the concept of triangle, you know what or at least you can work out what a triangle essentially is. It's a three-sided figure. You know, you can just thinking about it know that. Whereas an opaque concept does not reveal the essence of its reference. So, so an example might be water. Merely having the concept of water does not reveal to you what water essentially is. Water is essentially H2O, but you need to do some science to work that out. You can't know just through reflecting that water is essentially H2O. Okay, so these are the transparent ones reveal the essence, the opaque ones don't. So I think the key question in consciousness is coming to our experiential concepts. Are they transparent or opaque? Are they more like water concepts? They don't reveal what consciousness is, or are they more like triangle or geometric concepts? They reveal what consciousness essentially is. And I think that's the whole debate, in my view, kind of hangs and falls on that. So if you think that they're opaque, then I think materialism or physicalism makes perfect sense. But if you think they're transparent, materialism is screwed, right? So
I want to say, just to cut you off for a second, that you could have a transparent version and still physicalism is fine. So I want to hear what I probably do think they're somewhat opaque, but even if they aren't, I don't really see the force of it. But before we even get to that, can I ask about the triangularity stuff? Because certainly you're right about the essence of it, but it doesn't tell you whether triangles can be instantiated in physical objects. I mean, so the Aristotelian versus Plato debate about Plato claiming there are no triangles in nature, and Aristotle claiming, yeah, sure there are. So having the concept of triangle, I mean, I assume they both have the concept of triangularity, but yet even though its essence, what might it be revealed, it's not. A lot of these metaphysical questions are still open, right?
Yeah, and I'll just get some water.
Yeah.
There's a tap behind me.
The joys of live broadcasting.
I'm in my sister's kitchen. So, in the process of moving. Yeah, I mean, there are important differences. I would say geometrical concepts are not only transparent, they're merely transparent. Sorry, experiential concepts are not only transparent, but in certain cases, we know that they're satisfied. That's the kind of point we started off talking about. Whereas that's not the case with geometrical concepts, right? You don't know. You don't know for certain that there are only instances of triangularity.
Well, in physical instances, certainly Plato would have thought there are instances of triangularity. It's just that they're not instantiated physically. They're somehow in the realm of the forms or something. And so the debate between Platonism versus, nominalism about this stuff is not answered by knowing the essence of triangularity.
So what's this supposed to show about the consciousness case, or? Well,
I'm just trying to. So. Suppose that you thought the essence of pain was its painful quality. It still seems to me an open question whether or not that's something to do with brain states or somehow not.
Right. Well, it could be, but it might not be. But so I don't know. We just have to take the case in point, right? I mean, it's. Again. I don't know whether to explore this Aristotle case. Maybe let's just come back to the consciousness case, and then if you think it's relevant to what we're talking about, that it has a bearing. So I suppose I think so. Let's take the view you're considering the view where it's a transparent concept. It reveals the essential nature. Well, now suppose that physicalism is true, and our conscious states have a physical nature. Well, then it would follow that physical nature is apparent to us just through introspection or reflecting and thinking about our consciousness. So, to take the hackneyed and empirically implausible example philosophers always give. Let's suppose, pain is C fibers firing in the brain. That's what it is. Well, then you'd be able to know just by attending to your pain that it's C fibers firing. So neuroscience would be really easy. You could just introspect and discover the physical nature. But that seems clearly false. So where are we up to here? So I suppose that will be the rough and ready route from transparent concepts to the falsity of physicalism.
Right. So why think that move you made is a good one? So why think that if I know the essence of pain, its experiential essence, I guess I would want to qualify that means that I would also know its physical nature. I'm not sure why. So that's what I was trying to get at with the essence of triangularity there. I can understand its geometric essence, what it is, what its nature is, but that doesn't answer the question whether there are physical triangles, whether they're instantiated physically, or even whether this triangle is identical to that physical structure. That tells you something, gives you a framework for, I mean, that's maybe a wedge you could use to debate that, Plato saying, well, these things are somehow having properties that physical objects don't have, so they can't be, and then Aristotle saying, no, you got them wrong or something. But they both understood the nature of the thing they're talking about.
I mean,
maybe this is more what the translucent stuff is supposed to do in your work, so that there's an aspect of its nature which is revealed, which I would say it's experiential nature, which we're acquainted with or know directly. But then it's a further step to say, and that's all there is to it, isn't it? I mean, isn't that right?
So maybe, I don't know, maybe there are a number of different things going on here. So one thing is, if it's completely transparent, why does it follow that we'd know if it's physical? I mean, just on the Plato and Aristotle example, I suppose maybe I want to make the Augustine point again that, just because, in some sense, we know the nature, we know that, the essence, we can still make mistakes when we start theorizing. So I guess I think, in the moment of having an direct experiential concept, we sort of know exactly what consciousness is. But then when we theorize, we start making mistakes. But there's two different issues here, right? So as I said, one is, suppose you agree that it's transparent. Does it follow that the physicalism is false? But the other view is, the other thing is, why think it's transparent and not translucent? So maybe I should say that middle way, just seeing as we've introduced it. So I start off with these two extremes. Transparent reveals the complete essence. Opaque reveals the none of the essence. And then obviously in between you could have translucent concepts that reveal part of the essence. So the example I sometimes give, just silly example, is, being a sphere the same mass as the Earth. So being a sphere, we know a priori what a sphere is, but you need to do some science to work out the mass of the Earth. Anyway, so what I try to show is that none of these middle way translucency options work out. And, maybe we could go on to talk about that. And so we really have to choose between the extremes of transparent and opaque. And I think opaque is really implausible because we do know things about the essential nature of consciousness through experience, like, for example, red experiences resemble orange experiences. So we have to go for the transparent. But what do we want to talk about? Do you want to say, if you think that it is transparent, well then, if pain just is essentially C fibers firing, then, and you know for introspection what it is, then you ought to know that it's C fibers firing. I mean, so there is a position a few philosophers do. I think the majority of phenomenal concept strategists would say they're basically opaque or maybe a bit translucent. Number of physicalists have explicitly committed to that, and a lot of the time it looks like that, just looking at the theory of concepts. But a few physicalists have said, okay, they're both transparent. So I call this in my book dual carving. I don't know why I call it that now, actually. But anyway, so in dual carving, right, you've got the idea would be the pain concept completely reveals the nature of pain. C fibers firing concept completely reveals the nature of C fibers firing. But you just still don't, there's such different kinds of concepts, you still don't know they refer to the same thing. Is that the kind of view you're thinking of?
Well, that could be it, but I mean, I wonder if you would object to the qualification that it reveals the experiential nature.
Right. Okay, good.
So in terms of what it's like for you, I think that's the transparent part, but that might not be the entire, I mean, so if it's identical to a brain state, that's not part of what it's like for you. So that wouldn't be part of its experiential nature, which is revealed. So that's why I'm wondering. So that was kind of what the analogy with the triangularity was supposed to be getting at. You know, what's really revealed is its geometrical nature, but then there's a separate question about whether that's all there is.
So I would say a lot of people say they like translucency and then say exactly what you just said. I don't think that is translucency, because I mean, I would say what I mean by consciousness is just the experiential aspect. And you know, what I'm open to and what I kind of endorse in my book is what I call the consciousness plus hypothesis, that the consciousness, the phenomenology, is an aspect of a more expansive property. So I'm completely open to that. When I say transparency, all I mean is it's that the experiential aspect of what its likeness, as sometimes said, the experiential character is transparently understood. That's all I mean. But isn't that what we're talking about? We're talking about whether that is physical or not.
Yeah, but why would that be revealed in the experiential part?
Why would that be? Okay.
I mean, so if the revelation claim is just about, or the transparency claim is just about the experiential aspect of the thing, then that's, you know, I could go along for the sake of argument. That's completely revealed to us, and I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical of that. But anyway, so I could go along with it, that it's completely revealed to us in these direct kind of phenomenal concepts. But then if that thing is identical to a brain state, that's not part of its experiential quality. That's just its metaphysical nature. And no one, I mean, so it sounds to me like really what you're claiming is that revelation is a claim that its metaphysical nature is revealed in these kinds of concepts. And that's a much more, I think, harder claim to defend. I don't know. I
don't know the difference between nature and metaphysical nature. I can't understand. You know, what you just,
experiential nature versus metaphysical nature.
But what we're talking about, but the experiential nature is real, so that's metaphysical. I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking, what you just said sounds to me like the consciousness plus view that I'm happy with, that you know, we transparently understand the experiential nature, but it's part of a more expansive property, and we don't understand all aspects of the more expansive property. But I mean, I don't see the contrast between the experiential nature and the metaphysical nature, given that the experiential nature is part of reality, so it's metaphysical, and that's what we're talking about. We're asking, is the experiential nature physical or not? That's just,
the metaphysical part is supposed to get at how these things come apart or don't across possible worlds. So if it's metaphysically identical to the brain state, then it's necessary. Or at least I would, you know, I'm sympathetic to this view. There are other versions that I may be sympathetic to in different days, but, you know, right now I'm sympathetic to this. So metaphysically it's necessary, which means that in every possible scenario, that experiential thing is a brain state. That doesn't mean that the way it's revealed to the subject is as a brain state.
Well, I guess it sounds like you're giving a kind of modal definition of essence there, in terms of what holds in all possible worlds. But I guess,
but isn't that what physicalism is?
Well,
physicalism is the claim that, you know, these things, that it's necessary, that that consciousness is physical. that's at least the way I would interpret it.
I guess I'm sympathetic to the trend in grounding talk and Kit Fine notion of essence, particularly thinking that no, actually the modal stuff follows from essence. It's not, we don't define essence in modal terms. Rather, Kit Fine says, well, we should have a definitional notion of essence. So what do I mean by the essence of pain? I just mean what it is to feel pain, you know, what it is to feel that way. And I think when I have a direct phenomenal concept, I know what it is to feel that way.
Right, but that doesn't tell you
when other people are in pain. I know what it, and if what it is to feel that way was just to have your C fibers firing, then you'd know that. And so modal stuff follows from essence, but I wouldn't define. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess this is an area where there really is a disagreement, because I heard you first say, you know what it's like. And then you concluded by saying, I know what it is.
No.
Those seem different.
Yes, they are different. They are different. And you're completely right that that's an important source of confusion. You could think that they sound the same, but they're very different things. So yeah, I would say like David Papineau, for example, thinks he knows what it's like to feel pain, but he doesn't think you know from introspection what it is to feel pain, because what it is to feel pain is what pain essentially is. Whereas what it's like to feel pain is the kind of neutral way of putting, I don't know, whatever this starting datum is that we started off talking about. These kind of concepts, whatever's going on when you think about your consciousness in these terms.
Yeah, I mean, right, exactly. So you could have the view that these phenomenal concepts are satisfied.
Yes,
they're picking something out. It's experiential, but what they're picking out is a brain state, but they don't pick it out as that.
Sure.
They pick it out as an experience.
Sure, that sounds like the phenomenal concept strategy, or.
Well, I mean, everyone has everyone who endorses the realism of consciousness has to have some kind of phenomenal concept strategy. Ultimately, the details are where the differences are, and I'm not endorsing what is typically called the phenomenal concept strategy in the literature. But I think it's obviously you and I believe there are these things called phenomenal concepts. They're kind of unique or special. They pick out something which is private and only known by you, and we have to, by inference, attribute it to other people. So I mean, I don't think it's cheating in any way for me to invoke something I thought we had in common, which is that these things pick out the experiential natures of these things. But then there's this, what I'm just pressing you on is why I think that's all there is to its nature. That doesn't tell you what it is if what you're worried about is, zombie worlds or, weird transitions between digital persons and biological persons and all sorts of counterfactual claims that really some people would argue are really kind of getting at the essence of the thing in a sense of, in metaphysical sense, what it is as opposed to how it appears.
Yeah, so I said there's two things going. So why? I would say by definition, all there is to a conscious state is its experiential aspect, because that's just what I mean by talking of consciousness. I mean the experiential aspect, and only the experiential aspect. That's just what I mean. But that doesn't follow from that simple stipulation that it's transparent, because I think, again, David Papineau, I think, would agree that. That's just agree with what I've just said, but he still thinks the concept is completely opaque. That's all there is, the experiential aspect, but you don't know what the hell the experiential aspect is through introspection or attending to experience. So that's fine. It's fine to think that, but what I don't understand is the idea that you could completely understand the experiential aspect and it's purely physical, but you don't know it's physical. That doesn't...
Because the physicality is not part of its experiential aspect. I mean, it's part of its more fundamental nature or something like that. But can I?
Sure.
Well, I don't want to cut you off, so you can go ahead and finish with your thoughts. But go ahead.
Well, a very quick. Another possibility is I was arguing with Andrew Lee, having who's a PhD student at NYU.
Yeah.
A very similar argument where
he has that deep structure idea that they're making.
It ended up that, but what he meant by nature was like what grounds it. So I certainly think that you could know all about the experiential nature without knowing what grounds it. But that's not what I mean by knowing the essence. I just mean, knowing what it is to feel pain. But anyway, sorry, we don't. You carry on. You can.
That's fine. I think that's a good conversation. It's interesting and useful for me, at least. So I wonder what you would say then about transitioning to conceivability claims. What I'm not hearing you invoke is zombies, which is nice. I guess the standard view is that zombies are conceivable but not possible. My view is that they're not conceivable. but not because of something to do with analytic functionalism, which I think is the normal way to kind of cast that claim out, but rather because, well, more cautiously, what I would say is that there seems to also be conceivable what I have called shambis, which are physical duplicates of me, which have consciousness just like mine, but are just physical. So it seems to me, and I want to distinguish that from, so I know that Keith Frankish has a similar kind of view called anti-zombies, but I think that Keith and I really disagree, because he's an illusionist, and I find that view very puzzling, to put it mildly. So we can't be talking about the same thing, because when he's talking about anti-zombies, he means to be indicating creatures that he would consider illusionists, and they don't have consciousness in the sense that I'm talking about. So those aren't what I want to invoke. I want to invoke real consciousness, in the sense that we've been talking about, and say, look, it's conceivable that that's physical. So that, to me, and by conceivable, what I mean is not imaginable, if that's a pejorative term, but I mean logically coherent. So in the standard kind of Chalmers sense, that there's no obvious contradiction entailed by this claim, or else someone would have pointed it out. Someone would have published this paper, and that paper doesn't exist, and people have been looking for that. And the same is true with zombies. I guess it's really hard, and I've tried hard to try to find the contradiction in zombies, and every time I find something, people say, oh, well, you could conceive of this missing and that there. So I don't know. So it's really hard to actually say what the contradiction of these things in these things are. But certainly one of them has to be contradictory. It seems to me that there has to be a contradiction entailed by either zombies or shambis. They can't both be ideally conceivable. Maybe that's too beholden to 2D semantics. I don't know, but certainly that's what I'm sympathetic to. So what is your response to the claim that I'm conceiving of a purely physical creature, a minimally physical creature, just physical, but conscious just like me? You would have to say that's not conceivable, it seems to me.
Sure. Just before I answer that, so why do you think zombies are inconceivable? Because you think one of them must be...
Yes.
I see. Do you think conceivability is a bad word? I always think it should be rational coherence.
Yeah, I agree.
You get people just always thinking it means just imagining or something. And yeah, I'm starting to write now. Coherent. Anyway.
No, I know, and there are people who say, you guys are too obsessed with science fiction and watch too many sci-fi channel shows, and so just because it's imaginable, but what's imaginable is actually constrained by what's logically coherent.
Yeah.
So that's the view.
Say to people, no, what we're interested in is coherence. And, so I saw a talk, by Patricia Churchland saying, oh, who cares what's imaginable? Why should that? But if we're talking about coherence, then how else are you supposed to work out what's coherent other than sitting thinking about it? You can't do an experiment to show what's coherent. And so, yeah, I think we should change the word. But yeah, I think we agree on that. Okay, come back to Shambi. So I must confess, it's been on the periphery of my consciousness for a long time to think about Shambis, and I never got around to it. So then the last week, knowing I'm going to talk, I've been thinking, oh, what do I think about this? And it's really hard. And I kind of read what Chalmers says, and I think it doesn't seem very satisfactory. So I think I might have changed my mind a little bit on something, but. Well, I don't know. I mean, I need to think about this some more, but just to interject, I mean, I guess I don't hang it all on the conceivability argument. It's more the sort of transparency stuff we're talking about. But I do want to say that I do actually run in my book a conceivability argument, a zombie style argument in terms of the transparency stuff rather than the two-dimensional stuff, and I think that goes through. But I just think it's sort of surplus to requirements. The kind of core of what's going on is the transparency stuff, and I think the two-dimensional stuff and conceivability is a bit of a distraction from that. But anyway, I digress. To answer your point. So it seems to me, and it relates to this dual carving stuff. So I was thinking of, I think maybe in a sense zombies are conceivable, but I think I think of it slightly different how you do. So I was thinking in terms of this dual carving stuff. So the dual carving stuff would be that, you know, pain and C fibers firing, they're both transparent. They give you a complete grasp of the nature of the property, but you can't know that it's the same property, right? So it seems to me, suppose dual carving was all fine, then it seems to me zombies would be conceivable, at least because you could think of them as kind of a case of dual carving, right? You could think of them as a zombie world where that's true, where they're just really different concepts, but they're identical. Now, I argue against dual carving in the book. I think I have an argument that it's sort of, we lose all kind of constraint in metaphysics if we go down that road. But anyway, then you might think the problem goes away. But then I thought, well, although I reject dual carving, I don't think it's incoherent, right?
Right.
I don't think it's like contradictory. So then I ought to think zombies, am I pronouncing that right? Zombies are conceivable because dual carving is conceivable, right? Even if it's false, it's still conceivable. So these dual carving zombies are conceivable, right? So then that's a problem. So then I was thinking, so I think I have to think about it some more, but I think one thing now is, I think, you know, when one embraces, which I do, a kind of connection between conceivability and possibility, what you're embracing is that modality is intelligible, right? That if something's impossible, you can understand why it's impossible. If something's necessary, you can understand why it's necessary. And I think to embrace that involves rejecting dual carving. Because if you've got dual carving, you have these kind of identities that would surprise God, you know. So God creates C fibers firing and goes, oh my, I didn't know that would be pain, you know.
Right.
And that's like, you've got a necessity that's just completely unintelligible.
But that's only on the, not to cut you off too soon, but that's really a type B physicalism kind of result.
Yeah.
Whereas if you take my views from earlier that, you know, there's this a priori entailment, but it requires having both the concepts, then God's not surprised. He has the right concepts, or she has the right concepts. And so would make the entailment. Maybe the zombies couldn't or something like that. But what matters is the in-principle nature of the a priori entailment. Not whether you can do it or I can do it, but whether it's in principle.
So I guess I think there is no a priori entailment. Maybe we could go back to argue about that. We've got a disagreement there. There is no a priori entailment. Dual carving is sort of false, and I think it follows from that zombies are impossible because,
well, impossible but not inconceivable.
Yeah, so I think maybe what I want to say, but this is, as you say, you're not talking about this kind of dual carving thing, but I think what I want to say is, maybe in a sense, strictly speaking, they're conceivable because dual carving is conceivable. It's not contradictory, but to embrace a connection between conceivability and possibility is to sort of reject dual carving. So in embracing that, you sort of reject the possibility. So maybe in a sense, strictly speaking, that they're an exception to the conceivability possibility thing, but the anti-dual carving is just a sort of constitutive principle of, I don't know. And once we accept that if their impossibility follows, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does.
But so
I mean, I just would think that there should be more attention to these kinds of issues, because the conceivability argument against materialism is well known, but you know, there's an equally good conceivability argument against dualism of any kind.
Sure.
And I think this is the beginning of it, and they both can't be right unless you really reject conceivability and link between it and possibility, which you were sort of hinting at. Maybe this is an exception, which is pretty steep price to pay, I would say. Although I'm sympathetic to rejecting it. I'm sympathetic to lots of stuff. So because I don't really know what the hell's going on. I think this stuff is hard. I'm not a true believer, really. I mean, I guess my firmest commitment is just that we don't have good reason for rejecting a lot of these views. But that's something completely different.
Yeah, I guess.
So go ahead. Yeah.
So why go for? I guess your question. I agree. Why go for zombies rather than shombies.
Yeah.
I guess I think because I think there is no a priori entailment, they are radically isolated concepts, and they're transparent, and together with dual carving, that kind of rules out shombies. So I guess maybe strictly speaking, they are conceivable, and you're completely right. That would be a big thing, and I have to think more about that.
Because then it would look like your view and the kind of more traditional brute identity view are on all fours, so to speak, with each other. That because you're admitting some, that there's more to the realm of conceivability than what's possible. But on the other hand, these guys are claiming that these identities are not intelligible in a sense, and those are both big admissions.
Yeah, I guess I'd want to say it's a very constrained exemption. It's allowed because this anti-dual carving principle is part of what it is to embrace a connection between conceivability and possibility. I don't know whether that works out, but so it still wouldn't allow, across the board, gaps between conceivability and possibility. But
Yeah. So I mean, I think we could go on talking about this forever. I think there's a lot more to say, but let's transition from the negative case to the positive case. The argument against physicalism, it's complicated, I think, is the take-home message from our discussion so far. But I want to talk more about your positive view, the defense of Russellian monism, because honestly, I don't really understand it, especially in light of some of the things that you've said. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean, there's some things that I don't get, especially the cosmopsychism part. That's which I think you're most sympathetic to. There's some issues that I really just don't understand. So
okay.
I guess even before, I mean, I'm going to digress back for a second, but going back to Galileo, I wonder what you might think to someone who said the following thing. So Galileo says, take consciousness out of the physical world, put it in the mind. There go the qualities. But one kind of traditional complaint is that the qualities he put into the mind are the qualities as we consciously perceive them. And that lends itself to this idea that they're kind of simple and can't be explained in terms of physical theory. But so I think you're going to have to say yes to this, but is it the case that you reject unconscious qualities? So can I have an unconscious pain, by which I mean something that's painful but not like being in pain for me?
I guess I do reject that, but I don't think it's entailed by Russellian monism. I mean, so Russellian monism is the view that's most important to me, and that as a general solution to the problem of consciousness and so on. And it's more a family of views, and some of them, like Sam Coleman's view that the world is intrinsic nature of physical reality, involves unconscious qualities, and I think there could even be naive realist. I think I peer-reviewed a paper on this. Naive realist views where actually the qualities are out there and we perceive them. So I think they would all count as forms of. Should I explain Russellian monism, or should we just assume?
I mean, you can. I think people know what it is. If they don't, they should Google it.
So I think they all count. I personally do. I'm inclined to think there are no unconscious experiences. I don't think I have any particularly good arguments, to be honest, but it just seems to me that what we're thinking about when we think about experiential qualities are what it's like to have the experience, and that I can't sort of separate that in my mind from experience. And if you do have experiential qualities, like Sam Coleman does, it's hard to see how you can get unexperienced qualities, how you get experience out of them. So, but I'd want to embrace them as part of the family of Russellian monist views.
Yeah, so I guess that's one of the issues in this debate, because on the one hand there's the panqualityists who think that that's Sam Coleman's view, and I think also Chalmers ends up with something like this in his synthesis paper. His Hegelian synthesis of all this stuff is some kind of panqual, and he doesn't endorse it wholeheartedly, but he thinks something like this could be good. But I was more asking about unconscious psychological states.
Oh yeah.
So could there be a psychological state which is a pain? but not felt as painful. You know, a pain that you didn't know you had or weren't aware of having. So that nothing is like for you to have the pain, but it's still pain.
Maybe this is like a terminological thing, I'd say. I don't know. It depends what you can clearly have a concept of pain that allows for non-experiential states to count as pain that's more related to something functional or psychological.
So you're okay with that? That doesn't ring any alarm bells?
I think I'm okay with it, but
okay, yeah. Well, I mean, just because of the Galileo thing, I think that my take on that is that it's a mistake to relocate the qualities as consciously experienced and then say, oh, look, you know, we can't explain them scientifically, because really that sort of builds in already their simplicity. And I think this is part of going back to Revelation. Part of what I think you want that to do is that, I mean, the way you put it in your book, at least, is that what's revealed is that these things are not functional. They have an intrinsic nature, or intrinsic nature, who knows what that is, but it means something like that these are not characterized in terms of what they do. They're not in terms of their relations to other things or their causal effects or something like that. And that seems to be a byproduct of the Galileo move, rather than accurately capturing what it is we're trying to think about or theorize about.
Could you say more about what's the alternative you're thinking of? What's the alternative you want to advocate? Or?
Well, I don't want to really advocate my own view too much, but so if you think of the redness of red as just consciously experienced red, and then you import that into the mind and say, now try to explain it, it seems hard to do because, well, the only thing you have to work with is the experiential nature of it, the redness. But if you think, well, no, so there's a property out there, physical red, and then there's our conscious experience of physical red. Right. But in between that, there might be this other thing, the disposition, the functional, unconscious awareness of red. Right. And so if what we're trying to do is explain how conscious red shows up, it might be because of the two things we were just talking about, namely the functional concept that was tracking some physical property in the world, and then our awareness of that. Yeah. So, and I think that's what Sam Coleman wants to do too, in a different way. So there's the quality and then the awareness of the quality. Yeah. So these generally are versions of higher order theories of consciousness.
I mean, I wouldn't want to say intrinsic nature, or, I mean, is defined that it's not causal. I'd say that the very least, it's not merely causal. So the states that cannot be completely captured in causal dispositional terms, but that doesn't mean they're not. But I mean, you're saying it's not sure it's clear to me that when we return to our consciousness, it's revealed as simple. I don't think that doesn't seem to be completely obvious introspectively. I mean, part of this problem is, I think it doesn't seem that conscious subjectivity can be analyzed in more fundamental terms. I mean, that's what one of the more complicated bits of my book. I don't know if I was going to hear that. I tried to say, you know, you can't analyze what it is to be a subject in more fundamental terms, and that leads into the cosmopsychism as sort of an alternative mode. But maybe that's going to get...
That's the combination problem.
Yeah, so look, there are all sorts of problems here. There are all sorts of problems.
But before we get to that, can I just ask, so, I mean, one of the questions I'm trying to push towards is how committed you are to revelation, because if you're a panpsychist, then revelation can't be the full story, since the conscious experience has to be broken down or broken up, either way, depending on your version of smallism or cosmoism or whatever. But its real nature is these other things, the quiddities.
No, well, I'd say they're the things that ground my conscious experience. So if you're a bottom up panpsychist, it's the particle, or my consciousness is grounded in facts about particles, and then the particles are conscious. So those facts about microwave particles ground facts about my experience, right? But it doesn't follow that that they're part of their essential nature, because I mean, things can be multiply realized. So it could be that the heart, you can know what a heart is essentially without knowing its underlying what grounds it. So
right, but why is that move allowed for the panpsychists but not for the identity theorists? Like, because it's similar to kind of move I was trying to make earlier that you were objecting to, and now you're appealing to the exact same move. So I just wonder why is that legitimate in this instance?
It's whether you're talking about identity or grounding. So if you're talking about identity, it's just one and the same property. So the essence of X and the essence of Y must be the same. They're just the same property. But if you're talking about grounding, you could have the high level property and the low level property. They could be distinct. They could have different essences. I mean, it's not I'm saying there's no problems in this area. I'm sympathetic with a lot of the grounding literature that there must be some kind of constitutive connection and that the higher level stuff must kind of play a role. But I don't think,
So that's interesting. Then you wouldn't object to a grounding version of physicalism, which I take it a lot of non-reductive physicalists, that's what they want, right? That what they're claiming is that the consciousness is grounded in the physical, and then revelation doesn't get at that view.
I think there wouldn't be a priori entailment for one thing in the physical case. So I don't think purely quantitative stuff can entail qualitative stuff. So there wouldn't be an a priori entailment, but it could be that there's an a priori entailment in the panpsychist case from micro level qualitative stuff to macro level qualitative stuff. It's hard to make sense of that entailment, hence the combination problem. But there doesn't seem to me that the problems there seem to be more tractable. There doesn't seem to be a sort of in principle problem like there is, I think, in the case of physicalism and making sense of the a priori entailment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I wonder if that's more of a theoretical bias than a datum, because it seems to me they're just as intractable. I mean, the fact that you start with something experiential, which I guess is supposed to alleviate the intractability, doesn't seem to me to get you much foothold in the problem. So I know your view about this. I mean, I think I know it anyway. Your view is that maybe it's spatial relationships that are the thing that we don't know about, and their fundamental nature is something that is inscrutable to us, or some word of that nature that we don't know it. And if we did know that nature, then we would be able to do these a priori entailments. That's that right?
That's one view of explored. So yeah, so I don't agree like Galen Strawson thinks you just can't possibly get consciousness from non-consciousness. I don't agree with that. I think there are pretty good arguments, and that's what we've been talking about most of the time, that you couldn't get an a priori entailment from just purely quantitative stuff. I don't think there are comparable arguments that you couldn't go from micro experiential to macro experiential. It's especially because there could be stuff we don't know about, which is, how could you rule out that there's, there could be stuff we don't know about. I mean, another thing actually that I'm more and more sympathetic to is the possibility of some kind of emergentist form of Russellian monism. So it could be there's just genuine layers in the brain, and there's a causal relationship. I'm more and more thinking that nothing we know from neuroscience rules that out. And then you might say, well, why not just be a dualist? But I sort of think still, different ways of understanding causal closure. I sort of still think dualism is empirically implausible. If there was something outside of the brain impacting on it on a really regular basis, that would really show up. But if there were levels in the brain, if do we really know from neuroscience that, the cerebellum, this incredibly complicated thing, is completely determined by the causal properties of its particles? Do we really know that? So it's not obvious to me that there aren't layers in the brain. So you could be a kind of Russellian monist where you've got, my consciousness is the intrinsic nature of macro level bits of the brain, and then there's the consciousness of the micro level bits of the brain, and there's a causal relationship. So that would avoid this problem altogether. That's one up. So I'm open to both that kind of reductive and non-reductive approach. But even in the reductive case, I think that the problems that don't seem that the in principle arguments that you get it. And also, we've just spent less time on it, right?
No, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
We can do both. Let's do both. It's a lot
in defense of that, though, panpsychism is not a new view. I mean, it's interesting to look back at the history of psychology and how many of the early founders actually had panpsychist views.
Right.
Not to mention William James, but there's a whole host of the early members of the alleged science of consciousness, which psychology began as. Who end up with something, and even physiologists, and so it's interesting. This view's been explored for a while, maybe not, but I take your point. Ultimately, not as long as some of these other views have been, like about 400 years of mathematically based science or something like that, and certainly nothing like that serious has gone on. So I mean, can I just? I want to ask. There's tons of stuff I want to ask. We're running out of time. I can't keep you here forever, although you're being very generous with your time. And your answers, but so one part of me wonders why I think that there's intrinsic natures at all. So this ontic structural realism is something that is getting some attention. For my own take on this, I think that if you think about string theory enough, then some kind of structuralism is kind of forced on you. Richard Dawid has this really interesting paper. Kind of echoing of some things that were inchoate in my ideas by saying it really nicely. He is very clear in his thinking, an expert on string theory. But there's something in string theory called dualities, which really are just an empirical way of confirming Quine's underdetermination kinds of things, that there are theories which are very different in terms of their ontological commitments, but which are equivalent to each other. You can transform one into the other by a series of mathematics. And so I think one of the more famous ones, there's T duality, S duality. So there's technical stuff in string theory, but there's the more famous result that's getting all the attention nowadays is the so-called holographic hypothesis, which shows that, under certain considerations, a theory which is in, 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions like ours of space-time with gravity is equivalent to a 3-dimensional or lower dimensional theory without gravity. And there are different ways of fleshing that out. Of course, this is an anti-de Sitter space, and that's very different from our actual universe. But in principle, people think, well, so anyway, so those are kind of bread and butter for string theory. These kinds of dualities, that one theory that looks very different is really the same in all of its empirical predictions and et cetera, with very different ontology. I think that's one thing that makes string theory very, very different than any other theory of physics we've had, is these dualities. And I think that one of the lessons of that is that ontology is got to go. So that the idea that they're individuals is really called into question by this kind of duality thing. So that what's preserved is a structure, something that's not individuals. So, and of course, other people would appeal to quantum considerations, and I'm okay with that as well. I think string theory is a bit more solid on this because it's just part of the nature of the theory. But anyway, I know you have things to say about structuralism, but I wonder if you would, what is it that is wrong with this idea that there aren't any intrinsic natures at all?
That's all really interesting. I'd love to, and I'd like to read more on what you just said, or I hadn't thought of that particular point. And you just made me think. Just connecting to the last point of the last discussion, and I think Russellian monism hasn't been. It's getting more known in academic philosophy, but it's still completely unknown out, in neuroscience and in physics. And part of what I'm trying to do with Popular Book is, to try and get the idea. Because if it's going to be done, you've got to fill in the details, and it would be really cool to sort of just try and, think about neuroscience, do neuroscience, think about physics in these terms, and it sounds like a really cool challenge that I'll have to think about more. That you've just raised. Although I'd want to distinguish between. There's different kinds of structuralism. One thing that James Ladyman focuses on individuals, but that's different to. How I think of structuralism is more that there's just quantitative vocabulary, which I define as just involving mathematical, logical. That would be the more extreme, just mathematical, logical. Slightly milder version is mathematical, logical, or causal, or gnomic, like law of nature or something. Slightly. So that's what I mean by. So you could have forms of anti-structuralism in my sense that don't have individuals, and I guess some Russellian monists are sympathetic to that. You know, that some kind of is a bundle theory in this sense, or I don't know, just that the dropping individuals. But in terms of, okay, so just coming to the crucial question, you know, why not just think the structuralism? And I think that there are two reasons. So one, I do buy these kind of a priori arguments, although they're kind of, it's really sort of notoriously hard to persuade people, and it just sort of, sometimes I change my mind on it. But I do buy these arguments that when you just have causal structure, you get in a kind of regress. So Russell pressed this, my colleague Howard Robinson in the 80s pressed this, and you know, I do try to press a version of that. So we could argue about that, but also I just want to say that, you know, even if that argument doesn't work, so even if there are possible worlds where there is just causal structure, I'd say we still have a good reason to go for Russellian monism because of accounting for consciousness. I'd still say you can't account for consciousness in those terms, which is exactly the argument we've been having. Obviously you disagree, but that's exactly the argument we're having. So even if you could say, even if I conceded that causal structure is coherent, I'd still want to say fine, but it's not true in our world because there's consciousness.
But isn't it still would, you'd have to make conceivable that there could be consciousness in a world like that? Or now you'd want to say that's just not conceivable? I mean, I just don't see the incoherence of that view.
Well, I mean, I tentatively conceded just from what I've been thinking this week about Shombi's that, yeah, so maybe what is conceivable is this kind of dual carving scenario where the purely quantitative properties are actually identical with qualitative properties, but in this way where there's just no intelligible connection. So I think maybe that's in a sense conceivable, but I still think we've got good reason to think it's false, that kind of view.
I mean, but this gets back to, I think, again, what you were saying we were talking about. So it sounds to me like what revelation is doing for you is making it a datum that there's something with an intrinsic nature. That's part of what's got to be accounted for if you take consciousness seriously. I mean, I've heard you say this before in your talks and stuff, that the only thing that we know about matter is that part of it involves an intrinsic nature, namely the brain has conscious experience, and that's. But I guess I just don't see that revelation gets you that. I mean, I don't want to rehash everything we already talked about, but. So is that what you're, I mean, that's what's in the background of your thinking here, is that there's got to be something that has an intrinsic nature to account for?
I wouldn't want to load that into the data starting point. I want to agree with you on that starting point that, yeah, you know, we both have these experiential concepts, and, you know, we want to say that, or I don't know if you want to agree, but a lot of people can accept that these experiential concepts are satisfied, but maybe they can be satisfied by purely quantitative facts, or so on that starting point I want everyone, but then I would want to argue that those experiential concepts that we know are satisfied can't be accounted for in purely causal structural terms, and that's just, you know, the argument we've been having, that it's, I don't think there's an a priori entailment, I think revelation is true, I think dual carving is false. All those elements have to come in. It's a very complicated argument, you know. So when I say, oh, you know, in a hand wavy way, qualities and quantities, that's just the starting point. All these elements need to come in, but I think all those elements together get you that you can't account for consciousness.
So can I try to reverse this in the other way quickly? So suppose, I mean, I know string theory is very controversial, and the things that I was saying are even more controversial, maybe, although I think there are good arguments there. But, you know, string theory empirically is not confirmed, and there's the string wars going on, and blah, blah, blah. I think there are non-empirical reasons for taking it seriously, or non-phenomenological reasons. But anyway, so I recognize that that's a whole hairy brain can of worms. But let me ask you, so supposing that we had good reason for thinking that something like string theory was true of our world, like a lot of physicists working on string theory at least think that. I think that. So suppose we had good reason for thinking that, And suppose that the argument that if string theory were true, then some version of structuralism would be true. Then would you convert to illusionism? Would you then say, well, then we don't really have consciousness in the way that we think that we do?
I'm open to anything, I'm open to, I'm not a diehard. I'm open to be persuaded. That's an interesting argument. I suppose I'd want to hear a lot more about the move from, if I was to think, what I'd like to see is, can a Russellian monist version of string theory be made to work? That's what I'd love. We had this conference in Budapest last year, Russellian monism, time for the details. But it was mainly just philosophers talking, But I'd like to see, where it's genuinely, can we make sense of string theory? And I haven't thought of this before, the argument you're giving, but that actually what you're saying is, if that argument works, then the answer is no, but I'd want to know, is this structures in the sense of there are no individuals, or is it structures in the sense that it's purely quantitative causal structure? I'm still not crystal clear, and I think I just probably need to read more on the point.
Yeah, I'll share a link to the white paper, which I think puts it really clearly in the strongest way. So
it's clear to me that it leads to that string theory entails the kind of structuralism that's inconsistent with Russellian monism. But that's a very interesting argument. That, if that was to prove, I don't know, I'd probably become an illusionist before I became any other kind of. I think Chalmers says that as well. I think before, but
interesting. Yeah, and so we're really running out of time now. But can we talk about cosmopsychism before we fully run out of time? And your view. I know you've changed your mind about fine tuning recently, but I find that stuff very interesting.
Oh yeah.
So first of all, cosmopsychism is the claim, I guess, that the universe itself is conscious, in the sense of there being something that it's like to be the universe. Is that the sense in which the universe is conscious, or only is it in the sense in which? So I know you have this interesting distinction. You say, look, there's nothing that it's like to be the table, but there's something it's like maybe to be the basic elements of the table. That's not the kind of view you take towards the universe, is it? Or so I'm just not clear what sense.
Something that's like the universe. Yeah.
Yeah, you do think that.
Yeah.
And that what it's like to be the universe is that fact grounds our specific versions of consciousness.
Yeah, that's at least the view I defend in the book. I'm sort of, but yeah. So the idea would be this. It's the most complicated part of the book, that the actual defense of that, this monist position that facts about wholes are prior to facts about parts, and you might think that fits better with modern physics, fits better with quantum entanglement and stuff, and then you combine that with panpsychism, then you.
I don't know why there's any reason to think. I know you invoke the Scheffer argument here about entanglement, but I don't really. That's a very tendacious interpretation of quantum mechanics. That the entangled particles act as a whole thing, which the two things exist because of the whole. So that hangs a lot on an interpretation of quantum mechanics, I would say. Certainly the Copenhagen interpretation doesn't make that move. That's the view. As I get older and older, I think that really there's only one serious interpretation, and it's Copenhagen interpretation. And I don't know if that view is actually compatible with Russellian monism, to be honest with you. So I think a lot of this would depend. So I think it's interesting that sort of what's coming out is that a lot of these metaphysical claims that you want to defend ultimately may be beholden to empirical theorizing.
I'd love that to be more explored. In general, Russellian monism to be more explored. It's not obvious to any of these. It seems to me at the moment a very, very flexible view, because all it is essentially that there is something beyond causal structure, and that explains consciousness. And so that's a very flexible view. It's hard for me to see why any kind of position in theoretical physics would be inconsistent with that. But I'd be great to see it explored. But just on the cosmopsychism, and just as I emphasize in the book, it doesn't mean It's not to be understood necessarily as a form of pantheism. It doesn't mean that the universe has thought or reason or intelligence. I'd just say it's probably kind of mess. It's consciousness. So I have this article where think about, if you have that position and then you think about fine tuning, then maybe that might give you reason to think that the cosmic mind is something more like responsive to reason, responsive to value or something. But that's a further move just on the basis of fine tuning and none of that.
Yeah, but as far as the cosmopsychism goes, so one of the things that confuses me, besides whether there are any cases of priority grounding in the way that you want to talk about them, which I guess I'm sympathetic to the Daniel Stoljar point in his review of your book, that every example really is not an example. That's a different point. Maybe, and I'll let you respond to it. But the thing that really mystifies me is, why is this a version of panpsychism? So certainly seems, I mean, why isn't it a consistent view that the universe is conscious, that our consciousness is grounded in it, but there are no microphysical consciousness particles? It's just brains, but they're grounded in the cosmic consciousness. So I just don't know what the connection to panpsychism is with this cosmopsychism.
It depends how you understand panpsychism. I guess I define panpsychism as just the consciousness is sort of fundamental and ubiquitous, which I think is fulfilled just by the universe being conscious. But
why would it be ubiquitous, as opposed to only in brains like ours, but which is grounded in the cosmos or something like that?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of everywhere in the sense that the universe is everywhere. But yeah,
but it's not everywhere in the sense, or might not be everywhere in the sense that the micro particles are themselves conscious. Which I thought you were committed to. I don't know. So that's.
I mean, look, the Russellian monism, panpsychist Russellian monism, but even cosmopsychic, these are sort of theoretical frameworks to develop views, and ultimately it's going to be filling in the details and working out whether they work or don't work is going to be an empirical matter. But so I think cosmopsychism is consistent with only brains being conscious. Whether we call that panpsychism or not is a terminological question. Whether that would be a plausible view, that you've just got non-conscious stuff, and then until you get to kind of quite sophisticated biological stuff.
Well, you would still have the consciousness of the universe.
Yeah, it's consistent with that. Yeah, it's an open, and I don't sort of make a definite stance on whether I don't mean to make a definite stance in the cosmopsychism on whether particles are conscious. It's consistent with that, and it's just an empirical question. What's the best in terms of what's the best theory of consciousness? What's the how much consciousness is. So panpsychism says it's at the fundamental level, which for the cosmopsychist is the cosmic level, and how much, and it's definitely at the human and animal level. How much more there is just, I would leave as an empirical question.
It's hard to know what empirical results would help us with that question.
Yeah, no, it's notorious, but that's the same for everyone, right? I mean, because I would say, the problem is consciousness is unobservable. So there's these deep difficulties in the science of consciousness, but that's the same for everyone, right? Not just panpsychists. Right.
But if you're going to say that ultimately it's an empirical question, then that's where the issue comes in. So, I mean.
So I think it's empirical. So what I think, we need to take the data, which is empirical and is the reality of consciousness, and form the simplest, best theory consistent with that. I think I'm inclined to think a Russellian monist direction, that's a broad kind of theoretical framework, is the best way forward. And then you would have a result that our best theory, but it's an open question, the best theory of where consciousness is, how much.
Yeah. So finally then, let me ask you, if I can, about the multiverse. Because a lot of people see that as a consequence of string theory and cosmic inflation, eternal inflation, and all that stuff. There are multiple arguments for that. But anyway, so multiverse, some people hate it, some people love it. But I wonder how it impacts cosmopsychism. So, on your view, it wouldn't just be our universe which is conscious, right? It's any universe. Now, whether there are creatures like us in those other universes, which have their consciousness grounded in the cosmos, that seems to be optional. Or am I not understanding the view? So is it that only certain universes would be, or certain cosmoses would be conscious, or what exactly, how do we interpret this?
I hadn't thought about this, and I guess it would be an open question. I suppose it would be, I mean, I have this kind of simplicity argument that once you're Russellian monism, panpsychism is the default position, you know, because you'd need a reason, you know, physical science tells us nothing about the intrinsic nature. So the only thing we know is that brains have a consciousness involving intrinsic nature. So you'd need a reason to think there are two kinds of intrinsic nature rather than one. I suppose that would apply in the context of the multiverse as well, that, you know, you'd need a reason to think these other universes are not conscious if ours is, I suppose.
So then why isn't it the multiverse itself which is conscious, on your view, as opposed to any particular cosmos?
Yeah, cool. Maybe, yeah. Actually, that would, yeah. You're right. That would probably be the. Yeah, I mean, especially on the inflationary multiverse. I mean, it's really just one big universe, really, the inflationary multiverse, and these little things.
Right.
So I suppose the more natural, when you're thinking in those terms, the more natural thing would be.
My son is trying to get in on he has an objection he wants to make, my 3-year-old. Sorry, go ahead though.
What was I saying? Yeah. So maybe that would be the more natural view on the.
Interesting. Is it on your view not so? Is it not conceivable to take the line with the table towards the cosmos? So
you just made me think, because oh no, sorry, my mum was ringing and seriously with my daughter. I was thinking, oh, maybe it's a problem with my daughter, but she's just texting something random and unimportant. So anyway, sorry, repeat the question?
Is it not conceivable on your view what we can do with the table? So is it not conceivable that the universe has elements which are conscious, but it itself, there's nothing that is like for the universe? So like the way you want to talk about the table on a panpsychist view, isn't that something which is conceivable?
Yeah, that's conceivable.
Okay, and that's not any kind of evidence against or a basis for a conceivability argument against cosmopsychism?
So what's the conceivability argument?
That it's possible to have a universe that has parts of it which are conscious, but its fundamental elements are conscious or something, but the universe itself is not. So if it's kind of a zombie cosmopsychist argument.
That's conceivable and possible, but
so if that's isn't that an argument against cosmopsychism?
I mean, I think there is a conceivability argument against cosmopsychism, which is like it's conceivable that the universe is conscious, but we're not. We're zombies, and if that's the case, how can the consciousness of the universe possibly explain our consciousness? So that's a kind of like a form of the combination problem for panpsychism, which is sometimes put as a conceivability argument, and this is the equivalent for cosmopsychism. Sort of, I don't know. There's battles over what to call this, the combination problem for cosmopsychism. Some people call it decombination problem, or anyway, that doesn't matter. But I don't. So that's a problem. But I don't think the mere fact that cosmopsychism is conceivably false means it's a contingent theory. I take it to be contingent if it's true. So, just like panpsychism is contingent, right? There could be, even if it's true, it's not necessarily true, right?
Yeah. I guess I don't know.
The priority goes from the top. So it's the view is that the consciousness of the universe is the grounding thing. So you want to be worried about failures of a priori entailments from the top to the bottom, but not failure entailments from the bottom to the top.
Yeah, I guess I tend to think they should go both ways. And the same would be the case in terms of the brain. You should be able to deduce from the brain to the phenomenology, but also from the phenomenology to the brain states. It seems that's the way the arguments, I mean, it would be interesting to see the view defended only in the one direction, I guess, that we could deduce from the brain states what the phenomenology was, but not vice versa.
Well, I think, as I said before, I think it depends what we're talking about. If you're talking about identity, then it's got to go both ways. But if it's grounding, I think I'd want to know an argument why we should think it goes both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, there's 1,000 other questions I want to ask you, but I'm running out of time. I got to go and teach logic now, so got to go and get on the train.
I should bring my mum back as well.
Yeah. Do you have any final?
No, this has been great. I've learned. There's a couple of things I want to follow. I want to think more about Shambhis and the string theory stuff. That's yeah.
Well, I want to thank you. This conversation has been very useful for me too. It's a lot of fun. Great to talk to you about these things, and thanks for coming on into the lion's den. Hopefully it wasn't too bad. But anyway, I really want to thank you for making time for this.
Oh yeah, and I hadn't fully appreciated. I should have done, because I've read your stuff, but I hadn't fully appreciated the a priori entailment, but with distinct concepts. So I should think more about that as well.
Very cool. Well, maybe someday after you think about it, we'll talk again.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Richard. Have a great day.
So just hang on a sec. I'll say after we stop the broadcast. Okay.
Okay.